Hello, I'm Ciarán Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode, we bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. We're joined in this episode by Damian Costello, Sheep Specialist with Teagasc, who discusses temporary grazing this back end. Damian highlights some of the key considerations when taking on temporary grazing and how it can benefit both parties involved. Damian emphasises the need to ensure all animals are tagged before leaving the farm, and we discuss at length the various movement notification considerations for a variety of scenarios. Damian also takes us through the need to retain the movement records afterwards and how to apply for credit under nitrates regulations. We start off, however, with Damian highlighting the opportunities that presented itself this back end as a result of the good grass growing conditions.
It's been a good back end for growth, and in some parts of the country, cattle are starting to be housed, and there's grass available, but maybe ground conditions are not allowing for it to be properly grazed out with cattle. So maybe there are opportunities there for temporary grazing with sheep.
And certainly, Damian, in the more northerly counties, western counties, that seems to be the case. There's more appetite for lambs as well, we can see in March. So many producers might take that option of grazing. I suppose the caveat we always throw out with this, Damian, and follows last week's episode, it's still important to ensure we have enough of our own ground closed up before we move stock off it.
Well, that's exactly it, and getting, I suppose, the first priority is maybe getting your own grazing ground grazed out properly, and following your closing plan and getting your ground closed up for spring grass before you start thinking of moving to temporary grazing.
And look, certainly for those that are taking in them lambs and temporary grazing, there's a big advantage to getting them heavier covers cleaned off before spring and not carrying that dead material through.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, lots of farmers will welcome the opportunity to get those properly grazed off before the winter.
Just even like a couple of basic considerations before moving stock on the temporary grazing. So the fencing is one. There's a few others to take into account as well.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I suppose we're often asked, I mean, the prices that are charged, and it's very variable from farm to farm and from different parts of the country as to what's charged for this temporary grazing, and a lot will depend on say the type of fencing that's there on the farm. Does the person that's putting the sheep on have to come along and do a lot of temporary fencing, say in the case of a tillage farm or something like that? Is there water available on the farm? I suppose how much grazing is available, how long will, what's the appropriate number of sheep to allocate to the block, the quality of grass that's there. And again, a lot of March lambing flocks will be in the middle of their breeding season at the moment. So unless there's enough of grass on the block you're taking, maybe to carry you through to the end of the breeding season, maybe it's not a good idea at this stage for breeding sheep. It might be more suitable for, say, replacement ewe lambs that are not being put in lamb, we'll say, or dry ewe lambs. Store lambs possibly might be a better option for temporary grazing.
Stock you want to carry over, but again, maybe post-mating it's an option. But I think a point there, like the quantity of that grass on the farm that you're going to get enough of a period out of it, particularly if it's journey away from the home block.
Exactly. Doing an estimate to see is it worth your while, or is it appropriate maybe only to put a portion of the flock to this area so that they will get a meaningful grazing period out of it. So it's important, I suppose, to do an estimate of the quantity of grass that's there, and what's the appropriate number and how long will it last them really. And as you say, it may be an option that you defer this grazing. If it's the ewe flock is all that's on the farm, maybe post mating you'll have the opportunity to move them off for a month or 6 weeks before housing or that.
Just in terms of moving them off the farm, Damian, it's important we stay complying with the relevant regulations. Like we mentioned store lambs, I suppose the first thing you have to consider for any stock leaving the farm is to have to be tagged.
That's right, Ciarán, yeah. And again, it's the same as for any movement. A full EID set of tags must be on the sheep before they're moved off the farm. Again, it's not an issue, obviously, we'll say, if we're talking about ewes, but maybe younger stock or store lambs or ewe lambs or that, they must be they must be double tagged on leaving the farm.
And look, traditionally, if lambs are going to factory, ewes are even going to the mart or from farm to farm, we complete a dispatch document. The same is the case for temporary grazing, but there is slight subtle differences between how that's done. So, for example, like if a farmer was sending sheep to a tillage farm, maybe going to graze a forage crop, what are the requirements on the dispatch document in that case?
Yeah, it's a good question, and there are a few different scenarios there. And I suppose the first one you mentioned there is if you're moving to an all tillage farm where there are no livestock at all on this holding, and in this situation, the sheep can be moved to this holding for temporary grazing without any dispatch documents and without notifying the Department of Agriculture of the movement.
So, Dave, probably the most common one we're going to see is the temporary movement to a farm that has livestock on it, whether it be cattle housed area, that there's grass available this winter on. What's the correct procedure for that case?
Yeah, I suppose if there are any livestock at all on this temporary holding, we're talking mainly about a farm that's in by and large in one block. And even whether there's cattle or sheep, even if they're housed or they're separate, then the movement of sheep onto this holding should be notified must be notified to the Department of Agriculture. Now, there's no change in ownership, but the responsibility for notifying these movements lies with the owner of the sheep. So the way he notifies the Department of Agriculture of this movement to the temporary holding is that he completes a dispatch docket as he would if he was moving animals through the mart or the factory, and he sends the pink copy of that dispatch docket to the local Department of Agriculture regional office in order and they will record the temporary movement. So when the time comes to move them back, then he can notify them of the movement back to the holding of origin by sending the white copy of the same dispatch docket is sent to the regional office. And he clearly marks it then that this is a return movement from temporary grazing. So if there's any reason that there's a different number of sheep than what's on the original docket returning to the farm, for example, if some of the sheep were sold directly off the holding, he must note these numbers when he's returning back. When he's returning the white docket to the department, so he will note the numbers that are not returning, I suppose, to the farm of origin. That's the procedure to notify the department that they've returned to the holding of origin. And in the unlikely event, maybe in the case of Ciarán Lynch, if there are a number of sheep, if the number is different to the original holding, the numbers must be sent it must be indicated on the form. So in other words, if a number of lambs or something, if it was in the case of Ciarán Lynch, if a number of lambs went direct to slaughter from the farm of the temporary grazing farm, you would have separate documentation for that. And when you're returning to the holding of origin, you would identify these lambs on the original dispatch docket.
Same if they're sold on, you follow that procedure.
Exactly, yeah.
So what about the case then? Look, I suppose the key thing there is to make sure you fill in that return movement. It could easily be overlooked. But what happens in the case if they're going to a mixed farm on which there are no livestock? We say if a farm was in a finishing system and all animals were sold, does that differ again?
Yeah, I mean, there are some holdings out there where they're made up of a number of different land parcels or land fragments, which are completely separate, but they're all registered under the one. They're all belonging to the same holding or the same herd number. So, for example, the main block of ground might consist of the farmhouse, I suppose, and the farm buildings and the number of fields that are adjacent to it. But there's also maybe another fragment of land that can be either leased or owned, which is totally separate from the main block, but it's still, I suppose, it's still on the same basic payment application. It's still under the same herd number. It could be, there could be few kilometers in distance between both fragments, and in this instance the sheep can be temporarily moved to one fragment without the need for dispatch documents and movement notification, provided that there are no livestock whatsoever on the fragment of the farm that the sheep are being moved to.
Just fine, and you covered this I think already, but just for clarity, in the case of a store lamb, we say going to that forage crop and you're hoping they're going to be finished off it. So if they're going direct to a factory off this temporary holding, What covers that again, Damian?
Yes, that's the case, I suppose, and that would be very common in tillage areas. We'll say, particularly all tillage farms, maybe where they're putting in a forage crop, and they're taking in maybe lambs on a temporary basis, as you mentioned, finishing. So again, the initial movement to the temporary grazing is covered by what we were talking about already, in terms of a dispatch document, and the movement is notified as required by sending the pink copy to the local department office. But in cases where sheep are moved from this temporary holding directly to the mart or to the factory or the abattoir, and they're not going back via, I suppose, the holding of origin, then the normal National Sheep Identification System requirements apply. So in this case, the owner of the sheep, he fills up a new dispatch docket to accompany the sheep to the factory or wherever they're going. And he must also record this movement in the flock register. But it's not necessary in this case to notify the Department of Agriculture of a movement, as the movement will be notified automatically by the processor or the mart or wherever they're going. You know?
Just maybe, Damien, finally, in terms of just the movement aspect, I know you've covered a lot of bits of, but keeping track of the movements and keeping a record of them afterwards, what is the requirement now?
Yeah, again, I suppose the general requirements in terms of as we mentioned earlier, in terms of the tagging in accordance with the National Sheep Identification System need to be complied with, and again, to recap, they must be tagged by either the age of 9 months, or when they leave the holding of origin, whichever occurs soonest, and again, all sheep being moved, as we mentioned earlier on, to the temporary holding must be fully tagged prior to being moved to this temporary holding, and regardless of what destination they're going to, they must be tagged on leaving the farm. So in the case of the temporary movements, as we mentioned, they're notified to the Department of Agriculture, the local office, and the flock owner is required to keep a copy of the relevant dispatch documents that he has used to notify these movements, and the guideline is that they must be kept for a period of at least 3 years. So again, most people are keeping their dispatch docket books, for probably this period at least, and longer in many cases.
And just maybe finally, like in terms of regulations, for those looking for credit maybe on the nitrates, how do you go about that?
Yeah, and that applies, Ciarán, I suppose, to maybe a very highly stocked farm where they want to, I suppose, receive credit from the point of view of stocking rate for the fact that a number or all of their sheep are maybe off the farm for 2 months or 3 months or whatever the period is. And in order to avail of this, there's a record 4. It's the notification of temporary movement of cattle or sheep. This must be completed and forwarded to the nitrate section, the Department of Agriculture, Johnstown, Castle County, Wexford, and this should be completed prior to the movement of animals. So the adjustments will apply to both holdings. So I suppose it's important from that point of view that the holding that's taking the sheep in, you're not going to put them, you're not going to make them non-compliant, I suppose, by the temporary movement of the sheep to their farm.
So Damian, it's straightforward enough when you go through it and explain it, but there's a few bits to be considered there. And look, I think you probably got clarity on it. Yeah,
look, a lot of the detail are included in the Department of Agriculture's document on their guidelines for the national sheep identification systems and movements. I suppose the other thing we'd always say is, if you're in doubt, maybe talk to your advisor or your farm advisor or your consultant before you make any move, or before you do anything that you don't normally do, to see what is the paperwork that's required. Is there any requirement to notify the nitrate section and so on? So it is important maybe to seek a bit of advice if you're unsure.
Damian, good having you on. Thanks very much for that.
No problem, Ciarán.
Okay, we're going to finish up at this point. Again, Damian's highlighted the various considerations to be taken into account when taking on temporary grazing and the different movement notifications involved. I have included a link to the ANSYS document in the description, which will provide a more detailed guide of this and a reference for anyone to go back to. That's it for me for this episode. Again, for any updates on the sheep program, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Ciarán Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and listen in to any of our episodes.